In 1999, a Japanese motorcycle left a factory in Hamamatsu and hit a number nobody was supposed to hit: 194 miles per hour. No modifications, no tuning, not a prototype. A bike you could walk into any dealership and buy, no questions asked. But just a few months later, 4 of the largest motorcycle manufacturers on Earth, all competitors who had spent a decade trying to kill each other in a speed war, sat down in a room and said enough is enough. They made an agreement. An agreement to handicap every production motorcycle they would sell forever. But why? Why would they choose to make their own bikes slower? Well, the truth is, there were secret forces from the government, from competitors, that forced the motorcycle industry to kill its own golden age before the suits stepped in and made these bikes completely illegal. Today we uncover these secret forces to see how we got here, why the greatest speed war in history had to die, and what happens when a bike is built so incredibly fast that the entire world has to band together to stop it. That bike is the Suzuki Hayabusa. But you see, when you look at a Hayabusa, you probably wouldn't expect it to be the fastest bike in the world. It's kind of fat, bulbous and round, physically much bigger than most other sports bikes. But you see, nobody at Suzuki was trying to make a beautiful motorcycle. Their only goal was to make a weapon. But in the mid-1990s, Suzuki's engineering division had a roadblock to reaching that goal, and that roadblock had a name. It was called the Honda CBR 1100 XX Super Blackbird. And we'll get to that bike in a minute because its story is half of this story. But for now, all you need to know is this: Honda held the crown. They had the fastest production motorcycle on Earth, and Suzuki wanted that crown. But not by beating Honda a little, not the incremental power bumps that meant a new king every model year. They wanted to take the crown in a way that would make taking it back impossible. And one of the men responsible for that plan was Koji Yoshiura. Yoshiura was in charge of the styling of the Hayabusa, and years later, when the bike was finished and the world had spent a decade arguing about whether it was the ugliest sports bike ever sold, Yoshiura himself said one of the most honest things any designer has ever said about their own work. He wanted it to be, and I quote, grotesque. He wanted a strong initial impact, not something pretty, something you would never forget. And if the way to do that was to create something that looks like it was filled with helium, then so be it. Because every curve, every bulge, every weird swollen line on those fairings was doing a job. Because at 190 miles per hour, air stops behaving like air. It behaves like a wall. And the shape of a motorcycle becomes the single most important factor in whether the bike can physically get to the top of its power band without being shoved backwards by the atmosphere itself. So naturally, the Hayabusa was designed in a wind tunnel so it could always live near 200 miles per hour. The fairing shapes came first, the rider position came second. The engine was built to fit inside the shape that the air demanded. It was backwards from how almost every motorcycle was designed at the time. And that's why the Hayabusa doesn't look like every other motorcycle of the time. The nose looks like an insect because at speed that shape creates stability. The hump at the rear was oversized because it flows with the rider's back and reduces drag. Every ugly thing about the Hayabusa is ugly on purpose. Every ugly thing about it is the reason it works. Now, personally, and you might all agree, I don't think this bike looks ugly at all. I think it looks sick. It's iconic of a generation of sports bikes. But back in 1999, when it was released, this was a radical new design, and public perception was a bit mixed. Especially when Suzuki finally showed the thing to the world, painted in that bronze and silver color scheme. It was a weird choice when most bikes of the era were bright, flashy colors, but there was a deeper meaning to that bronze and silver, because they were the colors of the peregrine falcon, aka the Hayabusa. And to understand why that name matters, why it's actually one of the most quietly savage moves in the history of corporate rivalry, you have to understand what the peregrine falcon actually is and what it hunts. Enter the prey. The Honda CBR 1100 XX Super Blackbird. And in 1996, when Honda released it, it was the fastest production motorcycle in the world. 178 miles per hour, that was the number. And for a brief, specific window of time in the late 1900s, that number meant you were the king of a very small, very strange kingdom. The kingdom of production motorcycles designed to do one thing: go faster than anyone else on Earth was willing to. But for the Blackbird, you have to take one more step back, because Honda didn't invent the speed rivalry game, they inherited it. In 1990, Kawasaki released a motorcycle called the Ninja ZX-11, and the ZX-11 held the title of fastest production motorcycle for 6 years, 176 miles per hour. And 6 years of wearing the crown is an eternity in this category. Every other manufacturer tried to beat it, nobody could. Kawasaki had found some combination of displacement, aerodynamics, and sheer JDM tight engineering that nobody could crack. But then in 1996, Honda did. The Super Blackbird took the crown, not by a lot, barely 2 miles per hour depending on who was doing the measuring. 178 miles per hour. But nevertheless, it took the record. And Honda being Honda, they didn't just build the fastest bike, they built the fastest bike that was also civilized. The Blackbird had fuel injection, it had smooth power delivery, it had fairings to cut the wind but also keep you comfortable on a 2-hour highway run. It was, in classic Honda fashion, a refined weapon, a bike that you could do 170 miles per hour and also take you to work. That was the Honda way, after all. But here's the thing about what the Blackbird represented. In the mid-90s, among the Japanese Big Four, Honda, Suzuki, Yamaha, Kawasaki, the title of fastest production motorcycle wasn't just a marketing line, it was the only marketing line. Bikes already had a bad rap about being extremely dangerous, so to win, you basically had to make yours the most dangerous. It was the single most prestigious engineering flex a motorcycle company could have. Because if your bike was the fastest, it meant that your engineers were the best. It meant your wind tunnel was calibrated better, your engine tolerances were finer, your suspension was smoother. That top speed number was a proxy for everything else. And Honda had it. Which brings us to the name itself, because the name is where this story starts to get strange. And I mean really strange. As strange as the time that Zane became a pro racing driver strange.
Why you look like that?
I'm a racing driver now.
What?
And you could be too on Asphalt Legend. Asphalt Legends is the racing game you can play anywhere. Available on Android or iOS, Nintendo Switch, Xbox, and even your Steam Deck. It's high-intensity racing with over 200 cars available, complete with full customization. Race on courses from the city streets to the mountaintop. Escape from the cops and send your competitors to the scrapyard. It's mobile racing like you've never seen before, with graphics that will make you feel like a racing driver. And with Asphalt Legends multiplayer, you and all your friends can feel like Bonneville record breakers. Hit the link in the description or scan the QR code and get racing with Asphalt Legends. Yeah, that was pretty strange. Kinda like how the Honda Blackbird wasn't actually named after a bird. Not really anyway. It was named after an airplane. Specifically, the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, the American strategic reconnaissance aircraft that, at the time that Honda released the CBR, still held the record for fastest air-breathing jet ever built. Mach 3.3, flown above 80,000 feet. A machine so fast that it had to be refueled in midair on every mission. That was the reference that Honda was making for their bike. They said, our bike is the SR-71 of motorcycles. Our bike is a spy plane. Our bike is so fast that the Air Force uses the same word to describe something that flies at the edge of space. It is, I will admit, a very cool name. But it's also a name that contains a flaw. A small one, a linguistic one. The kind of flaw that in most contexts wouldn't matter at all. But in this specific context, in this specific rivalry with a specific engineering team in Hamamatsu paying very close attention to what their competitor was doing, that flaw became an opening. Because Blackbird isn't just the name of a cool plane, it's also the name of an actual bird, the Turdus merula, the common blackbird, a small, unremarkable songbird that lives across gardens in Europe and Asia, and a small unremarkable songbird that gets eaten on a regular basis by larger birds of prey. Honda was out here thinking about the speed, the altitude, the stealth, the Cold War mystique of Lockheed's Black Project program. They weren't thinking about songbirds, I'm pretty confident of. But you see, some sick, twisted engineer at Suzuki was thinking about the songbird. And here's where the cold calculations began. Because in the late 1990s, inside Suzuki's development program, a bike was taking shape that did not yet have a public name. It had a project number, it had specifications, fairings that Yoshiura's team had already shaped in the wind tunnel. What it didn't have yet was a badge. And when the question of what to call it came up, somebody in that boardroom did something that, in retrospect, is one of the most deliberate acts of corporate branding warfare I have ever come across. They looked at Honda's name, Blackbird, and they asked a very simple question. What kills a blackbird? Well, a peregrine falcon kills a blackbird. A peregrine falcon is in fact one of the primary aerial predators of small songbirds across the entire northern hemisphere, and it dives at over 200 miles per hour. It is, in every measurable sense, the thing a blackbird is most afraid of. And the Japanese word for the peregrine falcon is Hayabusa. And just like me sitting here telling you to hit the subscribe button right now, this was not subtle. This was not an accident. This was a company telling another company in public in a language that every journalist and every rider and every dealer in Japan would understand immediately. We built this bike to kill yours. And the truly remarkable part, the part that elevates this from being a clever marketing decision to something that borders on prophecy, is that when Suzuki finally brought the Hayabusa to market in 1999, the bike did exactly what the name said it would do. It didn't edge past the Blackbird. It didn't beat it by 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 miles per hour the way the Blackbird had beaten the ZX-11. It beat the Blackbird by 17 miles per hour in a single generation, first try. In a game that's typically decided by single digits, the Hayabusa didn't just take the crown from Honda. It ripped the crown off, stomped on it, and then set fire to the whole damn building. And when the world's motorcycle journalists finally got their hands on one and took it to a straight piece of road with a radar gun pointed at the end of it, what they found waiting for them was not just a motorcycle. It was the fastest thing a civilian had been legally allowed to buy ever. And well, it's the legally part that was going to become important, because the governments of 3 different continents were about to take notice. And this notice started right at launch. The Hayabusa was revealed to the motorcycle press in the spring of 1999. And the first thing that happened when the cover came off was that the room got quiet. Because nobody in the room had seen a production motorcycle that looked like this. The fairings were enormous, the tail was swollen, the nose was bulbous in a way that violated every unwritten rule about what a sports bike was supposed to look like. Journalists who had spent their careers covering the industry looked at the Hayabusa and did not know immediately whether they were looking at a breakthrough or a disaster. But then they read off the spec sheet. 1,299 cubic centimeters. The largest engine ever put in a production sport bike. 173 horsepower at the crank, a number that in 1999 simply did not exist in the sport bike segment. The Blackbird made 164, the ZX-11 made 147. And that number wasn't an improvement, it was a generational leap, the kind of jump that normally takes 3 generations to achieve, not just 1. And underneath all of that, the top speed, in excess of 300 kilometers per hour. 300 kilometers per hour is a number that, up until 1999, belonged to a very specific category of vehicle. It belonged to Formula One cars. It belonged to Le Mans prototypes. It belonged to hypercars that cost more than a house. The McLaren F1, the Jaguar XJ220, the Ferrari F50. Machines built in numbers you could count on your fingers, sold to people whose names were probably in the Epstein files. It did not belong to a motorcycle you could buy for $10,000 at a Suzuki dealership in Ohio. And when journalists finally got the bike out of the press tent and onto a runway with the radar gun, what they found was that Suzuki had, if anything, underestimated that number. The production Hayabusa stock out of the box was hitting 312 kilometers per hour. That's 194 miles per hour. And the motorcycle press was going gangbusters. It was less enthusiasm and more vertigo, because what journalists were being asked to review was not a faster version of something they already understood. They were calling it a new category of motorcycle altogether. Again, faster than most supercars, faster than aircraft that had set land speed records 30 years earlier, faster critically than anyone at the big four manufacturers had believed was even possible in a machine that regulators would allow to be sold to the public. And at Honda, their reaction was silence, which in this industry is kind of its own reaction, because Honda did not issue a statement. Honda did not announce a faster Blackbird. Honda did not put a replacement into development. Honda, the company that had spent years defending the production top speed crown, looked at what Suzuki had just done and then just quietly decided not to respond. And that silence tells you something important about what had just happened, because Honda's engineers were not less capable than Suzuki's engineers. If Honda wanted to build a motorcycle that could hit 200 miles per hour, I'm fairly certain they were entirely capable of it. The reason Honda didn't is the reason this story exists. Because the moment the Hayabusa's numbers hit the press, something else began to happen. Offices in Brussels and Berlin and London, departments of transportation in every country that sold Japanese motorcycles, the people whose job it was to regulate what civilians were allowed to drive on public roads, began to have conversations about the Hayabusa. Conversations about safety. In Europe, the reaction started in the press and moved upwards. British tabloids ran headlines about the 200-mile-per-hour death bike. German news magazines questioned whether civilian vehicles should be allowed to go that fast, which is kind of ironic considering they drive faster than anyone else on the planet. The European Parliament had a transport committee that started asking whether the category of hypersport motorcycle should be regulated at the manufacturer level. And regulating meant not limiting where you could ride these bikes, but limiting what manufacturers were allowed to build these bikes. And it was that, the idea that a law could cap the top speed of every motorcycle sold in Europe at a number chosen by regulators, not by engineers, was kind of a nightmare scenario for all four of the Japanese manufacturers. Because the business reality of the Japanese motorcycle industry in 1999 was that the four manufacturers did not compete on equal grounds across every segment. Honda had cruisers and touring bikes. Yamaha had sport tours and a deep racing program. Kawasaki had the smaller Ninja lineup, Suzuki had the bigger Gixxer lineup, but the flagship segment, the fastest production motorcycle, that was the crown jewel for all of them. It was the category where engineering prestige was measured. It was the category where all the marketing dollars went. Because having a Hayabusa or a Blackbird in the showroom is what sold every other bike. People came to see the 200-mile-per-hour king, and then they left with a 250cc starter bike. So if European regulators imposed a top speed cap on production motorcycles, a real, legal, enforceable cap, then that entire category of competition was gonna disappear overnight. The Hayabusa, by winning the speed war, had done something that none of the four companies had anticipated. It had gotten the attention of the people who had the power to kill the entire segment. And so, the Big Four, looking at what was discussed in every European transport ministry in the fall of '99, made a decision. They weren't going to let regulators decide the top speed of a motorcycle. They were going to decide it themselves. And over the course of the late 1999 and early 2000s, Suzuki, Honda, Kawasaki, and Yamaha held a series of private meetings. Meetings that, to this day, have never been fully documented. There were no official press releases. The only reason we even know about them is from journalists who broke the story later. Meetings where they negotiated something that had no historical precedent in the motorcycle world. They negotiated a ceiling. Not for their competitors, but for themselves. A gentleman's agreement. And the number they chose, the number that would define the top speed of every production motorcycle sold in Japan, Europe, and most of the rest of the world for the next 2.5 decades, was a number that was very specifically less than what the Hayabusa had already done on day one. 186 miles per hour. 8 miles per hour slower than the bike that caused the controversy. Now, there is no copy of this gentleman's agreement. There are no signed documents, there's no press, no photographs, no list of attendees, nothing like that. This is the inherent nature of a gentleman's agreement. It's informal, it's non-binding, it's built on trust and honor. But what we do have is evidence. Because starting with the 2001 model year, every production motorcycle sold by every major Japanese and European manufacturer had the same top speed, 300 kilometers per hour, or 186 miles per hour. Across 4 Japanese companies and at least 1 major European one, bikes with wildly different engines, displacements, aerodynamics, and power outputs. Bikes that on paper should have radically different top speeds, all arrived, suspiciously, at the same ceiling. And that is the pudding in which the proof lies. Now, Honda did come close to admitting it. They went on record multiple times stating that their motorcycles would never exceed 300 kilometers per hour, which is about the closest thing to a confirmation that exists in the public record from manufacturers themselves. Suzuki, the company that caused this entire debacle, has never spoken about it on record. Everything else comes from journalists. And honestly, the agreement is, in a very literal sense, just a rumor. A rumor that happened to govern the top speed of every production motorcycle sold on Earth for the next 15 years. But what's most interesting is that, according to the best reporting we have, Cycle World's reporting in particular, the manufacturer that pushed hardest for this agreement was not Japanese. It was German, BMW to be exact, which, when you think about it, actually makes perfect sense. BMW in 1999 was not in the top speed war. Their motorcycle division made sport tours and adventure bikes and the kind of machine a German engineer commutes to work on in the rain. BMW had no horse in the race that Suzuki had just won. But what BMW did have was exposure, because BMW sold motorcycles in every European market. Markets where these transport ministries were, at that exact moment, starting to draft regulations that would not have distinguished between a Suzuki Hayabusa and a BMW R1100. If European regulators imposed a top speed cap on motorcycles as a category, BMW's entire lineup was going to get swept up in the same legislation as the Hayabusa, despite BMW having done nothing to cause the problem. And with most government regulation, that top speed would likely have been much lower than the Japanese 186 mile per hour agreement. Maybe 155, maybe 100 miles per hour. So BMW did the practical thing. Cycle World reported that BMW executives had traveled to Japan and spoken to the Japanese brands with concerns that Hayabusas running amok on the Autobahn were going to, quote, cause bad things to happen legislatively. And well, the rest was history. But you see, these were motorcycle companies. And motorcycle companies are full of fun people with a couple screws loose. So the way they enforced the 186 mile per hour limit was elegant. The way they enforced it was, I think, the best detail in the story, because they didn't make the bikes slower. They didn't have worse aero or less horsepower. They made the bikes think they were slower. It was a software limitation. The ECU reads the wheel speed, and when it gets to 300 kilometers per hour, the ECU cuts fuel delivery. The engine stops accelerating, and the bike coasts at 299 kilometers per hour indefinitely. The mechanical capability to go faster is still there. The engine's still making the horsepower, the aerodynamics still work. The only thing that changed between the 1999 Hayabusa and the 2001 Hayabusa was a few lines of code. It is the same motorcycle wearing a paper leash. But oddly enough, there was one manufacturer still trying to take the crown: Kawasaki. Because in 2000, after the agreement had been reached, but before it took effect, Kawasaki launched a motorcycle called the ZX-12R. And that's because years before the Hayabusa came out, years before the gentleman's agreement was a thought, Kawasaki's engineering team had been watching Honda's Blackbird hold the crown, watching Suzuki's rumored hyperbike take shape in the press, and they built what they believed would be the motorcycle that would beat both of them. The ZX-12R had a 1199cc inline 4. It had 178 horsepower. It had an aluminum monocoque frame that no production motorcycle had ever used before, and it had been engineered from the ground up to hit 200 miles per hour. And according to testing done before the gentleman's agreement was enforced, it was rumored to be capable of doing exactly that, somewhere around 197 miles per hour in unrestricted form. Faster than the Hayabusa, the king killer's king killer. But Kawasaki had built a motorcycle designed to beat the Hayabusa at the exact moment that beating the Hayabusa became, by private treaty, kinda illegal. And they had spent years and millions of dollars engineering a weapon that got one model year of freedom before being permanently limited to the same number as every other bike on the market. But you see, even in that one little model year, once media outlets were able to test the bikes out, the ZX-12R fell short. It never even got close to beating the Hayabusa's top speed. And well, that was its only chance at dethroning the king. Because even if Kawasaki did have another trick up its sleeve, an engineering improvement to get it faster, it couldn't be implemented before the gentleman's agreement went into effect. And this, dear viewers, is the strange position that the Hayabusa now occupies in motorcycle history. The ones that were built and sold before the cap took effect, 1999-2000, are not just rare bikes. They are the only production motorcycles that will ever legally, technically exist in that category. The 2001 Hayabusa is still a Hayabusa. It's the same engine, same frame, same fairings, but it is a different machine in the way that matters. It is a motorcycle that has been told by its own software that it is not allowed to do what it was built to do. Of course, it didn't take long for aftermarket delimiters to be sold and unlock the full speed, but nevertheless, the Hayabusa is and will remain the fastest production motorcycle ever sold in a world where going faster was still allowed. The gentleman's agreement, by the way, was eventually broken. MV Augusta broke it first in 2007 with a bike they called the F4R312, but they weren't part of the Big Four, so it didn't hit as hard. But BMW, though, the company that had allegedly started the entire conversation, broke it a few years later with the S1000RR. Then Ducati delivered the 1199 Panigale with a digital speedometer that would simply go blank when the bike exceeded 186 miles per hour, a plausible deniability move that fooled nobody. And by the mid-2010s, the agreement was less of a binding truce and more of a polite fiction that most manufacturers still pretended to honor in writing at least, but nobody really honored in practice. But you see, by then it didn't matter. Because from 2001 until, depending on how you count it, somewhere in the late 2000s or early 2010s, the fastest production motorcycle in the world was not whatever bike was being currently sold. It was a bike from 1999. The Suzuki Hayabusa will forever be the king because it was the bike that won the speed war and then killed the speed war, which makes sense. After all, they named it after a killer. If you like this video, then you'll love our deep dive on the criminal enterprise that created NASCAR. You can hit the join button or become a patron and get early access to videos as well as a whole bunch of behind the scenes content.